Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Amila Golich, and I am the Assistant Director for Public Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're delighted to welcome Jean-Claude Trichet back to the Council tonight for our Global Economy series. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global engagement and active U.S. engagement in the world. Please note that the views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. As well, the Council is a membership organization, and we would like to thank our members for their support, which makes it possible for us to produce affordable, accessible, and independent content. If you're not yet a member, we're still in the start of program season, so this may be the perfect time to join, and I hope that you consider one of our membership levels, which begin at $100. Turning back to tonight, we are on the record and we are live streaming. We welcome your engagement on social media, but we prefer our tweeting to be quiet, so please make sure that your phones are on silent. Later, we'll be taking questions from the audience in the room, as well as through our online browser-launched app, which you can find at chi.cnf.io. If you forget that address, that will be on our screens to your left and to your right throughout the program. Before I turn it over to Jean-Claude Trichet, I would like to spend a few moments introducing him to you. He is currently chairman of the board of the Brussels think tank Bruegel, and also serves as the chairman of the Group of 30 and the chairman of the European chairman of the Trilateral Commission. In his long and illustrious career, he has held many roles, including as governor of the Bank of France, member of the Council of the European Monetary Institute, and of course as the head of the European Central Bank from 2003 to 2011, in which role he was instrumental in shaping the EU's response to the global financial crisis. The last time Mr. Trichet spoke at the Council was in 2014 on the crisis of advanced economies, but tonight we look forward to his insights on what appears to be a new moment for Europe. Economic indicators show robust and widespread growth across sectors and countries of the Eurozone, and despite Brexit and lingering political uncertainty due to forces such as populism, the European project appears to be more resilient than some thought. There's much to discuss tonight. I will return later to moderate Q&A, but without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jean-Claude Trichet.
Thank you very much indeed for this nice presentation. I would say two nice presentations, but I understand it is la loi du genre. I'm very happy to be there in the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, not for the first time, and to see old friends and new friends, including Michael Moskov, with whom I had worked a lot in the past when he was with his previous responsibility here. We had a special bond, I have to say, which I cherished, and I still cherish. So I have an important issue to discuss with you and to respond, if you have any question, on Europe, on the euro, on the future of the euro, and perhaps also a little bit on the recent past of the euro and of the euro area, as well as European Union. And I see that you are numerous. I see that you are anxious to have the response to the question that you have in mind. It reminds me the story of this European professor invited, not in Chicago, but elsewhere in the US, in a university which was interested in the euro in the making. Say that it was in something like 95, 96, 97. So he was very happy to be invited, prepared a speech, prepared very carefully slides to be projected, and came at the time he was asked to come, namely 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock he had a little bit surprised because there was nobody in the room. So it was a little bit surprising again. He concluded that the euro was not very fashionable in this university. But after all, he had made the trip, he had prepared a speech, and he was standing ready to start. And when one person entered the room, well, he considered that at least he had a meager audience, much meager than was expected, but he started, delivered the speech, 1 hour speech, And at the end of the speech, he was packing his notes and the slides and about to leave when the guy in the room said, sir, please don't leave. I am the next speaker. So that was emblematic of the interest in the euro. And now I see with great satisfaction that there is a much bigger interest in the euro. So let me say a few words in trying to respond to the question, where do we stand now in Europe and in the euro area? I would say both as regards the real economy, as regards the reasons why we can present now an economy which is growing and growing a little bit more than was expected. Second, I would like to respond to the question, why were the Europeans vulnerable to the sovereign risk crisis? What were the reasons? What were the corrections which were decided in the heat of the crisis? And where do we stand again now after having taken these measures? I will expand a little bit perhaps on the overall resilience of the euro as a currency and of the euro area as an entity. And then I will respond to the question, what would be the new avenues for further progress in Europe, both as regards the economic and financial integration of the European, the EMU governance, as well as perhaps other avenues that are open to the European. And I will conclude and be ready and stand ready to respond to your question. But first, before responding to the first question, let me only mention two important messages that I have and that are necessary for understanding better what's going on in Europe and what was going on in the world, by the way. First, we had to cope with the worst financial crisis since World War I in the years 07-08, subprime crisis 07, which was the trigger of an absolutely dramatic crisis with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. That's the first message. To understand all what has happened, to be clear, in the US as well as in Europe, one has to be sure that we understand that we had something which was exceptionally grave. And I would say, had we not responded very boldly and I would say also swiftly to this situation which we had to cope with in 08, after 15th of September 08, perhaps we would have had the worst crisis, economic and financial crisis, since World War I. Namely, it could have been worse than 29-30. We have to understand that. I think that I express my own views, of course, on that, but I probably convey the sentiment that my colleagues, central bankers, had when we had the burst of this crisis. Second message, the members of the euro area, the members of the European Union have a double challenge. First, they are a grouping of advanced economies, so they have all the challenges, today's challenges of the advanced economy, which are very numerous, and in the US, you know that better than anybody. Competition of the emerging world, India, China, Mexico, Brazil, you name it. Enormous transformation of our economy and society under the technological change, ICT, of course, but also a lot of other technological surges that are on a very large front. The malaise, the frustration of a large part of our population for many reasons, including the two I have already mentioned, and also the cultural changes that are something which is very, very important in all our society and is part of the frustration. And we have all that exactly in the same fashion. I mean, we are advanced economies. We have the same challenges. On top of that, we are bold enough to embark on an historical endeavor, which started 67 years ago with a speech in year 1950. And that process, which is very bold, obviously, which had never been tried in the history of humanity, this boldness explains that the challenges of the European are, again, as I said, I would say, very, very large, because, again, they have all what the other advanced economy have, and also their own boldness, their own challenge of the historical endeavor. How to merge progressively a number of important countries which were in the advanced economy at the moment of the start of the European Union, the number 3, the number 4, the number 5, the number 6. So that makes something which is extremely important, and decide to create a single market, then to create a lot of institutions that are pan-European, with a European Parliament, a European Court of Justice, then to embark on this also extraordinary endeavor, which is the euro, and to have a single market with a single currency, which is grouping a number of European citizens, which is of the order of magnitude of the United States of America. So you have to keep that in mind all along my exposition in order to better understand what happens. So first chapter, if I may, where do we stand now in Europe and in the euro area? It's absolutely obvious that we had a very difficult period of time, a period which was aggravated by not only, of course, the financial crisis, but also, and it is specific to the European, to the sovereign risk crisis, which blocked growth in a large proportion of the euro area, because we had, you might remember, 3 countries and then 5 and then 6 countries that lost their creditworthiness at a certain moment, had to cope with restructuring and adjusting their economy, and were obliged, of course, to compress their domestic demand because they were posting a very high level of current account deficits from, something like -3, -4, up to -15% of the GDP in the case of Greece, -10 in the case of Portugal. So you see very big imbalances to be corrected, and of course that created enormous difficulty. Now, where do we stand now? I will not surprise you in telling you that Europe is doing much better as a whole, that the euro area is doing much better, that we are posting regularly now 0.6% of quarterly growth. In Europe, we compute quarterly growth quarter on quarter, so it would be translated in the US language, it would be 2.4, 4 times 0.6. And we are posting the 17th successive quarter of growth. Unemployment is diminishing significantly. We have created 7 million new jobs in the last 4 years. This was overdue, naturally, and we have a lot of hard work to continue to do, but as you see, the derivatives are going in the right direction, if I may. The trend is much better. The trend is good. I also note that this growth of the European is surprising the observers and the international financial institutions. To give you symbolic illustration of this surprise, the IMF 6 months ago was considering that the euro area growth would be probably this year 1.7%. The last projection of the IMF 6 months after is 2.1, so a correction of 0.4%, a full 0.4%, which is quite big. I don't exclude myself that we could post 2.2 this year. Again, we will see. The problem is not exactly the level this year, but is it sustainable? Is it broad enough to be sustainable and to be long-lasting? And I take it that it is likely, if we continue to manage properly our economies at the level of the various member countries and also at the level of Europe as a whole, I think that we have good reasons to continue to have, for a certain period of time, this phenomenon, which again surprised a little bit the observers, because they were used to consider that Europe was necessarily the laggard in the constellation of global economies, and particularly of the constellation of advanced economy. So let me give you 5 reasons very rapidly for this surprise that we have and that the observers and international financial institutions have in the present period. I think that one very important is that we were lagging in the business cycle in comparison with the US. So because of this very difficult challenge of the sovereign risk, because of the period we had to devote to redressing the creditworthiness of a number of countries, which together were representing something like 37% of the GDP of the euro area, so a very important proportion of the euro area, we were lagging in comparison with the business cycle of the United States of America. And my estimate of the lags is probably 3.5 years, so it's not negligible, 3.5, 4 years. So now we are at a level of our business cycle which correspond to what the US has experienced some years ago. That's the first explanation I can give to understand better. Second, of course, the adjustment took place. The 5 or 6 countries which have major difficulties are practically now all in surplus as regards their current account, which were, as I said already, in deficit. A lot of hard work has been done in macro policies to adjust. And so they are now in a situation where they can grow, and they are growing. They are all now growing, and growing for those who adjusted as well as possible quite rapidly. Ireland is a case in point. Spain is a case in point. Portugal is growing. We have even Greece is growing. So we have really done in this respect at the national level as well as the level of the Europe as a whole and Euro area as a whole. We have done work which is paying off now. Third reason, structural reforms have been made in many countries, particularly in those countries that had major difficulties. And those structural reforms, again, are paying off. If you want to augment your growth, not only on a cyclical basis, but on a secular basis, you have to work both on the macro policies and, of course, on the structural reforms. A fourth reason why one can explain the situation of the euro area and of Europe as a whole, and perhaps also the difference with some other countries in the advanced economy, is that we obviously have room for maneuvering. There are breathing space. The current account, consolidated current account of the euro area is plus 3.45%. It's probably more than is needed. And I would be more happy if we were posting, say, only 1.5. So that is not, of course, necessarily the ideal optimum position. Still, of course, it means that we have, in the present world, the capital to invest more without asking the rest of the world to finance us. We have the money, possibly, to consume more, and that creates, of course, an environment which is, by definition, favorable to growth because money is there and money is available. And a last point, which is also very, very important and has to be fully understood, we have, together with the hard work done in a number of countries which had major difficulty, there has been a general resynchronization of growth and of the business cycles, I would say, in the euro area. So that now that all countries are growing, there is a mutually reinforcing growth at the level of the euro area as a whole, which is now very visible. To give you an idea of what has happened, we have now the standard deviation of national growth, which is at the lowest level since we compute that. Since the setting up of the euro, certainly, and even before the setting up of the euro. So resynchronization of the various economy is part of the reason why we are in a situation which is much more flattering than before. Now, I respond to my second question. Why were the Europeans so vulnerable to the burst of the crisis, and particularly after having had to cope with the financial private risk crisis? We had this morphing of the financial crisis in a crisis of the public signature, and there we were in a situation which transformed the euro area in an area where the epicenter of the sovereign risk crisis was localized. I used to say, discussing with Ben Bernanke, we used to say, finally, the epicenter of the crisis crossed the Atlantic. The epicenter of the crisis was clearly in the US with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. We were all, of course, I would say, thanks, if I may, to contagion at stake, we were not spared by the crisis, but the epicenter came from the US, and the epicenter crossed the Atlantic, and it was in Europe that we had the epicenter of the sovereign risk crisis. And by the way, not only the epicenter, but the sovereign risk crisis. Not in all Europe, and that has to be fully understood, in a fraction of Europe. I already mentioned the 5-6 countries that were at stake. I mentioned the percentage of GDP of the euro area that was at stake, something like 37% approximately. The other countries were not touched. And the paradox of the euro area was that we had a stretching between, I would say, inside the advanced economy, the worst signature, and you can certainly mention Greece as the worst of the worst, but you had also other signatures that were considered by the global investors and savers as particularly vulnerable, Ireland, Portugal, and we had also the best signature in the advanced economy. Germany remained a very good signature. Netherlands remained a very, very good signature. So you had a stretching between bad signature in the eyes of the global investors and savers and very good signature. And that was something which was specific to Europe, specific to the euro area. Now, why did we present to the global investors and savers a number of signature, a minority of signature, which were considered particularly vulnerable? And there, again, I see 5 reasons for that, which I will list very rapidly, because consider that each of these reasons are some kind of title of chapter for your questions when we are in the question and answer session. First reason, we did not respect the Stability and Growth Pact. I think it's an important reason, because the quid pro quo for embarking on a single currency, not having a federal budget and a federal political institution, was precisely that we had to be sure that the fiscal policies would be reasonable and would be in a range which was considered acceptable from the standpoint of the cohesion of the euro area and from the standpoint of the overall, I would say, macro balance in the euro area. So you know the rules, the famous 3% and so forth. I don't insist. The SGP, Stability and Growth Pact, was not respected. And I have to say that the big countries have a special responsibility, because there was an alliance in 03 2004. At the moment, I was myself made president of the ECB, between France and Germany, not to respect the Stability and Growth Pact. So I can go back in the question, but that's the first reason, in my opinion. Second reason, we had in our framework of economic and monetary union, EMU, we had no monitoring of the intra-euro area, relative cost competitiveness, persistent divergences, and we could see that we had countries that were augmenting their competitiveness in terms of having a very good control of their cost in the euro area, in the single currency area, and other countries that were losing competitiveness in having cost evolution, not only cost, of course, revenue, cost, prices, evolution, that were diverging and making them lose their competitiveness. And you can explain part of what I already said with this observation, namely those who were losing competitiveness had very big deficits and very big current account deficits. They had also a big budget deficit because they were also augmenting the wages and salaries in the public sector, in the civil service and so forth, more than the average, and they were, I would say, complicating their fiscal policy from that standpoint. That was the second reason, I see, a very important reason. First reason can very well explain Greece and Portugal. Second reason would explain more, perhaps, Ireland and Spain, where it was combined with bubbles in the real estate or bubbles in the financial sphere. But the same phenomenon of losing competitiveness was observed. Third reason, there was no instrument to tell the market we are able to defend ourselves, of course, provided the country concerned would embark in the appropriate adjustment and the appropriate structural reforms. But we had no capacity to decide, like the US did, in a very short span of time, the TARP program. We had to go through the various capitals, and that was a complicated exercise, a very complicated exercise, to be frank. So now we have what we need, and it seems to me that we have something which is credible, but at the time of the crisis, we had not that. Fourth reason, we had no banking union, and the absence of banking union was augmenting the stretching I already mentioned, because in the crisis, all the countries of the advanced economy had to say, we will back our banks, systemic banks, if they have big problems. And that's the reason why, after Lehman Brothers, you had no other major bankruptcy of systemic financial institutions in the US or none in Europe. But it was not by chance. It was because the central banks were extraordinarily, as I said, bold and swift, but also because the government said there will not be a collapse in my own courtyard, in my own country. And it was some kind of blanket political guarantee, which was necessary at the time, but of course aggravated, I would say, the difference of perception by the market, because when they were looking at financial institutions, they were looking very much at the creditworthiness of the backstop offered, the political backstop, if I may, not only technical, political backstop offered by the country itself. So the stretching I already mentioned was augmented because the countries that were creditworthy were correctly backing their institution and reinforcing the solidity of their own financial system, and the countries which were very unfortunately out of appropriate creditworthiness were, of course, damaging the signature of their financial institution. So you see the crisis revealed very, very much to which extent the interaction between credit worthiness of the public and private sector was very closely correlated in the crisis. And the fifth, because I mentioned 5 reasons, the fifth reason was certainly the insufficient completion at the level of Europe as a whole of both the structural reforms that are overdue in Europe still, and had been decided but not implemented as they should have been, and also the fact that the single market itself has not been fully completed. Very rapidly, there has been corrections given to the 5 reasons I just gave. We have reinforced the Stability and Growth Pact. Whether it is correctly implemented is another story, and I can respond to a question on that. But we have reinforced the Stability and Growth Pact. We have created, responding to the second cause, we have created a new pillar for governance, economic governance in the euro area, which is the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, MIP. I would love to hear more often after SGP, MIP, because I trust that it is a very, very important pillar for governance, for economic governance in the euro area. We have now a European stability mechanism, so the instrument which did not exist at the moment of the crisis is now there. We have now decided to embark on banking union, so even if it is not completed, you see that hard work and structural reform of major importance has been made in this domain, and all Europeans have said that they would reinforce their attachment to completing the single market and also to embark on the structural reforms that I already said are overdue. So you have an idea of, going in a very difficult crisis. We are now out of this very difficult period, but there is no time for complacency at all. Of course, we have a lot of hard work to do to complete, but again, we proved to external observers, investors and savers globally, something which is very, very important in my opinion, and that I associate with what I said when I was speaking of the boldness of the European to embark on a very important historical endeavor. The resilience of the European concept appeared to be largely superior to what was anticipated. And I was myself, actor during all this period. I can tell you that, I would not say in Chicago, but in New York, the sentiment that in the worst financial crisis since World War II and perhaps the worst since World War I, it was very unlikely that the euro would prove resilience and would be there as a credible and solid currency. And it was extremely likely that the euro area would be dismantled. And you have the memory of all articles signed from time to time by very eminent personality, by economists that are very, very important and eminent. So it was a general view, which I can understand. These Europeans are extremely bold. We are in the worst environment possible, ourselves in the advanced economy, ourselves in the US. How can they survive in such circumstances? And we survived. You all know that the euro remained credible. The paradox is that myself, as president of the ECB, the main criticism I had at certain moment on our monetary policy was the euro is too strong. For a currency which was called to disappear, of course, it was a little bit paradoxical. And as regards the euro area, it was clear that the euro area as a whole was in a very difficult situation. I already mentioned the 5-6 countries that had major difficulties. But the euro area is still there. So the idea that the dismantling of the euro area was extremely likely appeared to be plain wrong. And I have to say, a lot of difficulty to explain to many friends the world over, in the US as well as in Asia, that they were making a mistake in assuming that the euro area would be dismantled. By the way, the facts are there. I will give you the number of countries that were members of the euro area at the moment of Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. We were 15. Do you know how many we are today? So, since Lehman Brothers up to today. Who knows?
27.
Pardon me?
27.
No, unfortunately, not yet. Not yet. But thank you for your confidence. No, we are 19. So 4 more countries entered in the euro area after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. And the 15 that were in the euro area are still in the euro area. So there was no departure, no leave of any country, and 4 new countries entered, which of course is a paradox for an entity which was called to be dismantled. So one should not underestimate the resilience of the European endeavor. I consider not only the euro area, but the European endeavor itself. And I take it, of course, because you will tell me, but how do you explain Brexit in this environment? It seems to me that there is a big difference, which is, probably commanded by history, by geography, by culture, between the perception of the United Kingdom and the perception of the other members of the European Union, the 27 that you mentioned. And that, of course, would call a very long exposition because, as I said, history is at stake, geography is at stake, the cultural differences are at stake. But it's clear that the resilience of the currency, the economic resilience of the euro area, and the political resilience also were quite remarkable. And you could see the political resilience with this succession of elections which took place in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, and before you could see that the Greek people wanted to stay in the euro area, and that was very, very clear from all survey. And the survey which are the most pertinent are really indicating that there is an attachment to the euro area and to the European, I would say, brotherhood, which is largely superior to what was anticipated by many. France is a case in point because the extreme right is drawing lessons from what has happened in the second round of the election, and the sentiment that it was one of the elements which was adverse in the second round was that they had projected the idea that they would leave the euro and would leave Europe. And they have changed now their position, which has created some turbulences in this political party. But that tells a lot, it seems to me, on what I was calling the cultural resilience, or the political in the noble sense of the term, the overall, across the European continent, resilience. Now, I will conclude on the future. After this very brief, and of course, as I said, these are titles of chapter, a presentation of the recent past, of what has happened, what has been done, what are the new avenues which are possible for European integration and for EMU governance. What are the dimensions where it would be advisable, at least in my own standpoint, and possible, taking into account the resilience I already mentioned, and the fact that we have a window of opportunity in Europe, which is quite exceptional, with precisely the confirmation that the European endeavor is considered appropriate by our people after these elections, and the fact that my own country, together with Germany, together with all the countries that I can see in Europe, are willing to advance. Of course, advancing in which direction is the real question. I see two major areas where clearly there is the sentiment that we could advance. One area is not EMU at all, not economic and monetary union, not monetary, financial, or economic. It is the domain of security, of defense, of control of the borders. So it seems to me that recent experience, the threats that we are seeing in
the neighborhood of the European is creating the sentiment that we should advance in the fight against terrorism, in the fight against all, these crimes that would be cross-border on our own continent. And that is something which is now resented, it seems to me, particularly terrorism, in a number of countries as really a must. We must cooperate, unite much better to combat this kind of criminality. And it is all the domain of what I call domestic and external security. Part of it is the control of the borders. The migration is, the uncontrolled migration is an enormous problem in Europe for many reasons, particularly because there is an incredible destabilization in Africa and in the Middle East, and because also there are many areas where entry in Europe is not correctly organized. So it seems to me that the large consensus for organizing better some kind of collective, collegial control of our borders, some kind of federal control of the borders of Europe, is something which is already in the mind and already in the pre-decisions taken by the Council, the governments in Europe, and by the Commission. Defense is also an area where it looks like the people of Europe would back a new advance, and where, of course, we are in an environment which has changed since we examined in the past the question of defense for many reasons. We have the threats coming from the Middle East and potentially from Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, which is a real issue. We have the threats coming from Russia, which are not perceived at all in the same fashion when you are in Poland or when you are in the Baltic states or when you are in Scandinavia. But there you have the clear sentiment that there is something that has to be taken into account. Of course, I already mentioned the threats coming from the Middle East. And we have the sentiment, I dare say that in front of you, that the United States, for reasons that are not cyclical necessarily, but probably more structural, is envisaging more and more some kind of withdrawal from the European defense. And so, and I would not say that it is the new administration. I would say, if we look at it in a longer-term perspective, it seems that it is because the US people itself does not like too much now to embark in, new venture, new defense venture, new problems of that kind since Iraq. So all this creates in the European public opinion the sentiment that perhaps there is a case for reinforcing attention given to defense. By the way, they were encouraged by the US, not only this administration, but the previous administration, to spend more for their own defense. We were called to spend more for our own defense. So you see, it seems to me that you have the combination of objective factors, of structural factors, also of cyclical factors. If I take the destabilization of a number of countries, and of public opinion, I would say, evolution, that would perhaps permit to advance in this domain, as is visible in speeches that are delivered at the present moment. Now, if I turn to EMU, there are 5 areas where it seems to me that EMU, the governance of the single market with a single currency, which is probably called to enlarge when time comes. I mean, there is no urgency at all. but now that the UK left, of course, the difference between the euro area and the European Union is a little bit different in terms of perspective, strategic, historical perspective. We will see. But in any case, we have to run correctly the euro area as it is. And we, as I said, there is no time for complacency in any respect. We proved resilience, but we also proved that we had to augment our own quality of governance. So I think that one area is the Minister of Finance of the Euro area. I was the first to propose that we would have a Minister of Finance of the Euro area in 2011 when I was in Germany in Aachen. And I can respond to questions on that, but it is something which for me is important. Second, we could envisage to transform the European Stability Mechanism into a European Monetary Fund, which is something which has been floated by the German Minister of Finance, has to be reflected upon. You can have several organizations of the European Monetary Fund, but in any case, it is something which has to be looked at. A third issue might be to have some kind of stabilization fund to have the possibility of accompanying at the level of the euro area as a whole the cycle when we are in the buoyant episode of the cycle by collecting money to have this fund well capitalized, and then perhaps to spend that money when we are in the depressive episode of the cycle. This is an idea that has been floated. Other ideas could be floated in this domain of budget of the euro area. The Chancellor herself said perhaps we could have a small, I guess, in her mind, budget which could finance structural reforms in the various countries. We have to complete the banking union, which is not completed, and we have to start the capital market union, which is something which, in my opinion, is very, very important. Now, I hope that I was not too long. Let me only conclude in telling you, to understand Europe, you have to place yourself in the US in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. It is history in the making. And we have to understand that to understand what's happening in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your remarks. So we have some time for questions. We have a number of questions coming in online, but if you have a question in the room, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone to get to you, and please make sure that your question is a question, not a statement. So let's start here in the front row with Council Senior Fellow Phil Levy.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you about what you mentioned was countries converging. And in particular, if you look at Germany, the last couple of years, they've had a current account surplus over 8%. Does that matter? And does the euro area have if it does matter, does the euro area have the tools to address this? If absent the euro, you'd think about a Deutschmark appreciation. What can happen under the current setup?
Very quick response. You're absolutely right. We are at the level of 8.5 approximately current account surplus. When we started the euro area, the current account of Germany was in deficit. So when you hear Germany is very strong, it's permanently strong and so forth, that's not true. Germany started the euro area in a situation which was difficult in terms of competitiveness, in terms of cost competitiveness, in terms of trade, and in terms of current account. Germany managed very well, I have to say, its own economy in maintaining cost discipline and national inflation as lower than the average of the euro area, and with a view of solving the problem of unemployment, which was gigantic. You know, in my first 4 years of presidency in the ECB, I was told regularly, how can you run the euro area with Germany, which is the sick man of Europe? I was responding, no, they have difficulty because of reunification. They have to cope with their problem. They are coping with their problem. And year after year, they are regaining competitiveness. So what I would expect from Germany would be that the normal functioning of a market economy, when you have 8.5% of current account surplus, you invest more domestically. You have more demand for augmentation of wages and salaries, so your costs are going higher, which is a way to revalue the implicit currency, if I may, but without touching, of course, the euro. And you are progressively creating the conditions for being at a normal level, and I would say for Germany, taking into account its own demographics, it would not be aberrant at all to have 3% of current account surplus, or 3.5, but it means a lot of difference with what we observe today. Now, on top of that, one can say that the MIP, the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, is a pillar of governance which would tell countries like perhaps Italy, France, you have to care for your cost competitiveness and your overall I would say, improvement of your situation in order to combat large unemployment, and which would tell Germany, you have room for maneuvering. And, but the most important room for maneuvering, in my understanding of the fundamentals behind the 8.5, would probably be to, during a certain period, to be more open in terms of cost augmentation.
Okay, let's go in the back, in the second row from the back.
Thank you for your talk. In your talk, you mentioned 5 factors that made the sovereign crisis in Europe so painful. It seems that those 5 factors were exacerbated by a banking system that had too much leverage and, as a result, not enough capital. It's been several years since the end of the sovereign crisis, but European banks still have far more leverage than banks, say, here in the United States. My question is, do you think you can really have a strong European banking system that could withstand another crisis like this with the current leverage ratio? And related to that, do you believe enough regulatory changes have been put in place to strengthen the European banking system, and if there are any more regulations you think are necessary? Thanks.
Very good question indeed, which call for a number of comments. First comment, of course, in Europe as well as in all the world, the prudentials have been dramatically changed, and the Europeans are sticking with the new prudentials. So a lot of progress were made in comparison with the period before the crisis in Europe. Perhaps, as you said, less than in the United States of America, and I will come back to that with my second observation. You have to understand that at the moment of the crisis, 75% of the financing of the European economy was coming through banks, the rest through markets. In the US, 75% of the financing of the economy was coming through markets, the rest through banks. That makes an enormous difference between the structure of financing of the European and of the US. For us to embark on very rapid recapitalization beyond what was called by the new regulation, the new capital requirements, and the new rules was much more costly in terms of the economy as a whole than in the US. For that simple reasons. The banks of in the US, if you take all the balance sheets, are dwarfed in comparison with the same in Europe. And by the way, let me also mention that part of this situation is very paradoxical, because it comes very much because the government, the special agencies that you have in the US, which are semi-public institutions, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, do not exist in Europe.
they are there in the US to protect the banks from excessive risk. And we do not have that in Europe. So again, in comparing the financing of the two big economies in the advanced economy, we have to take that into account. That being said, of course, the ECB has always called very, very strongly for reinforcing the resilience of the financial system. And I think, again, that we have still work to do. By the way, it was a recent speech coming from the ECB, which was precisely continuing to call for hard work in this domain. So it is a domain where we still have hard work to do. It is also, I have to say, a comparison with the US, which I think is a little bit too simple for the reasons that I have mentioned. To give you also another illustration of this difference between the US and us. When we were in the dramatic crisis, liquidity was evaporating from everywhere. In the US, the main problem was to inject liquidity in the market. Because if the market were totally illiquid and had to close, the financing of the US would totally disappear. And that's the reason why the Fed intervened very importantly from the very beginning on the markets, purchasing a lot of tradable securities. In our case, the main problem was evaporation of liquidity from banks and the disparation of our money market, the absence of financing for banks. That's the reason why our main instrument at the beginning of the crisis was to give liquidity without any limit to all our banks at fixed rate. So we were embarking on an off-balance sheet commitment, telling all our banks, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trillion of collateral which is eligible. You have to know that we stand ready to give you all the liquidity that you will ask. It is something, it's an off-balance sheet commitment, a full allotment at fixed rate, which has not been perceived, in my opinion, by the observers, the external observers, particularly from the US, as important as it was, obviously. And that's the reason why, again, we still maintain that. We still have the full allotment at fixed rate in Europe. Thank you for the question, anyway.
So I want to make sure that we get in one question from online. So a number of people want to know, do you anticipate a banking crisis in Italy?
I think that the situation was, before the recent decision, a real issue. It seems to me that after the decision which were taken, we are in a situation which would not call for having that fear. That being said, as I already said, at the level of Europe as a whole, the more you are reinforcing your financial institutions, the more you permit to your economy to be correctly financed. And even if we have more financing through markets, and the ECB helped to have more financing from markets, we still, of course, rely very, very much on the financing by the banks. And but in Italy, I have to say that the figures I have in mind are demonstrating that the situation has improved recently quite significantly.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So let's go here to the third row. Please wait for the mic. It's right there.
Sure. I just had a question about what your perception is of Brexit, and do you think it will be a hard Brexit, or do you think the Europeans and the Brits will negotiate something similar to what the existing arrangements are?
The existing arrangement with whom?
With the Brits, with the British. Do you think it's going to be a hard Brexit?
But you were referring to Canada? You were referring to
No.
Norway?
No, I'm just saying, like, how much do you think the relationship will change between the British and the rest of the EU as the Brexit negotiations get underway? Do you think it's going to be a hard Brexit, or do you think they'll work out?
Frankly speaking, I think the main problem is to know what the UK wants. Once you know that, you have simplified the problem considerably. You know that at any moment they could say, finally, after having reflected, we prefer to stay in the single market. even in leaving, Norway is in the single market after not participating in the EU. That would be a big political decision because to accept to be in the single market, then you have to accept the legislation of pan-European legislation, the court, the pan-European court, and you have to accept a free move of persons, citizens of the European Union, which seems to be impossible taking into account the reason why Brexit was voted. So I don't underestimate the enormous difficulty that London has to interpret correctly, all taken into account, and the many dimensions that are there, the decision of the people in England. All what I can say is that nobody on the continent would like, a drama. And the idea we want a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit is a discussion in London. You have the Remainers who think, rightly so in my opinion, that it would be much better to have a soft Brexit. But you have the Brexiters that have won and that have another standpoint. Again, the democracy is democracy. A decision has been taken. It has to be transformed in, I would say, as I said, goals, clear goals, and then we will see. The UK will defend its interest, and everybody anticipates, of course, that the UK will defend its interest as well as possible. The other 27 also, by definition. What I trust is that in such a negotiation, it's all taken into account. It's exactly like in all other domains. There is an implicit positive sum game if the negotiation is well done, but we will see. In any case, of course, the departure of the UK, as I suggested, transform quite considerably the European historical endeavor. That is also an element which is very, very important. Let me conclude on that, because we are very sad that the UK has decided to leave. The 27 were all wishing that Mr. Cameron would win. We consider, and I think that I can speak on behalf of the continent, the entire continent, that the UK was one of the sanctuary of market economy, one of the major sanctuary of democracy and representative democracy, one of the major sanctuary of human liberty, human rights. So the idea that this country leaves is very sad and considered very sad. And that makes an enormous difference with the period where historically the UK was knocking at the door, wanting to enter. And you might remember General de Gaulle was not for the entry of the UK. So we were in a totally reverse situation. UK wanted to enter, and the continent, at least some on the continent, were not favorable. Now all 27 are favorable, and the UK decides to leave. Very sad.
That is all the time we have tonight. Please join me in thanking Jean-Claude Trichet.